Call security. She's trespassing. The words cracked through the executive boardroom like a judge's gavel. Sharp, final, unquestioned. And for a moment, no one moved. Not the assistants lining the glass wall. Not the analysts frozen mid-note. Not even the 6 board members seated around the 12-foot walnut table where a $2.3 billion acquisition was minutes from closing. Because standing at the far end, calm and unshaken, was Danielle Brooks. Dressed in a fitted black blazer. No designer label. No badge. No introduction. Just presence. The kind that didn't ask permission but didn't need to either. And still, to them, she looked like a mistake that slipped past security. Something to correct. Something to remove. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Danielle Brooks. The chairman, Richard Halston, mid-50s, silver hair, navy suit tailored to authority, leaned back in his chair with a slow, dismissive smile, eyes scanning Danielle like she was a disruption to be handled, not a person to be heard. This meeting is restricted, he said, voice low but edged with control. You're not on the board. You're not on the list. You don't belong here. A few soft chuckles echoed around the table, subtle, practiced, the kind that never needed to be loud to carry weight. One woman adjusted her glasses without looking up. Another man tapped his pen like this delay was costing him something more important than dignity. And near the back, a junior associate hesitated, eyes flicking between Danielle and the chairman, sensing something no one else was willing to say out loud. Danielle didn't move, not when the door opened. Behind her, not when 2 uniformed guards stepped in with measured steps, not when one of them paused just inches away, waiting for instruction, because she had seen this before, different rooms, different faces, same assumption, same quiet decision that someone like her had wandered too far into a space not meant for her. And still, her voice came steady, almost soft. Let the meeting proceed. Richard let out a short laugh, shaking his head like that sentence alone confirmed everything he believed. Proceed, he repeated, leaning forward now, palms flat against the table. You're delaying a multi-billion-dollar deal. His tone sharpened. Remove her. One of the guards shifted closer, the room tightening, air turning dense, but Danielle's expression didn't change, not even slightly. Her eyes moved once, slow, deliberate, across the table, memorizing every face, every reaction, every silence. And then she reached into her pocket, not rushed, not defensive, just precise, pulling out her phone like it belonged there, like she belonged there. And with a single tap, she said, calm enough to quiet the room without raising her voice, you might want to check the ownership registry, updated 15 minutes ago. For a second, no one reacted, as if the words had not landed yet, as if the room itself needed time to process what Danielle had just said. But then the first laptop snapped open, followed by another, and another, the quiet clicking of keys spreading across the table like a ripple no one could stop. Richard Halston's smile tightened, just slightly, the kind of shift only someone watching closely would notice. That is not how ownership works, he said, voice measured, controlled, but thinner. Now, like it had lost a layer of certainty, across from him, a board member refreshed the internal registry portal, once, then again, his brow furrowing deeper each time. It is not loading, he muttered, but it was loading, just slower than usual, as if the system itself understood what it was about to reveal carried weight. Danielle remained exactly where she was, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, posture straight, unshaken, as if time had slowed around her while everyone else scrambled to catch up. Near the back of the room, the junior associate leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen in front of her, fingers hovering above the keyboard like she was afraid to touch it, afraid that confirming what she was seeing would change everything. Sir, she said quietly, almost to herself, but the silence in the room pulled her voice forward. There was an update filed 15 minutes ago. Richard turned sharply, irritation flashing across his face. Then it is a clerical delay, nothing more. But his words did not settle the room. They hovered, uncertain, like they no longer carried the authority they once did. One of the guards shifted his weight, glancing from Danielle to the table, waiting for the command that no longer seemed so clear, Danielle's. Phone remained still in her hand. No more tapping, no more explanation, just presence, the kind that made people question themselves without a single raised voice. Another board member finally spoke, slower this time, each word deliberate. It says majority shares have been consolidated. A pause followed, heavier than anything before it. Transferred under a single holding entity. The air in the room changed, not loud, not sudden, but undeniable, like pressure building before a storm breaks. Richard leaned forward again, but this time it was not confidence driving the movement, it was urgency. Whose entity? He asked, sharper now, the question no longer rhetorical. The junior associate swallowed, eyes still fixed on the screen. Brooks Capital Holdings, she said, and for the first time, someone at the table looked directly at Danielle, not with dismissal, not with amusement, but with recognition that something had shifted beyond their control. A man on the far side of the table shook his head slightly, disbelief creeping in. That is not possible. We would have been notified. Danielle finally lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes without hesitation. You were, she said, her voice even, precise. You just did not recognize the name when it mattered. The room went still again. But this time it was not confusion holding it together. It was realization, slow and unavoidable, one by one. Screens refreshed, numbers updated, and the structure they had walked into that morning. The hierarchy they trusted, the control they assumed, began to rearrange itself in real time, and Danielle stood at the center of it. Not louder, not bigger, just undeniable. The words did not echo anymore. They settled, heavy and irreversible. And for the first time since Danielle walked into the room, no one reached for authority, no one issued another command, because the numbers on their screens were no longer suggestions. They were facts, and facts did not bend to titles or tone. Richard Halston stared at the display in front of him, his fingers hovering above the keyboard but not touching it, as if pressing a key might make it worse, might confirm what he was still trying to deny. This is a temporary consolidation, he said finally, but the confidence was gone, replaced by something thinner, something uncertain. Across the table another board member shook his head slowly, scrolling through the filings. No, it is not temporary, he replied. Voice low, controlled. It is complete, full transfer of controlling interest. The phrase hung in the air like a line no one could step back from. Complete, full, controlling. Each word removing another piece of the structure they thought they understood. Danielle did not move. Not even to emphasize the shift. She simply watched, letting the room arrive at the truth on its own. Because that was where real power lived, not in forcing the moment, but in allowing it to unfold until no one could deny it. Near the back, the junior associate leaned closer to her screen, scrolling further down into the documentation, her voice quieter now, but clearer, steadier. There is a clause here, she said, drawing every eye again. Executive authority transfers immediately upon consolidation. No waiting period, no board vote required. A silence followed that felt different from the ones before, not confusion, not hesitation, but recognition, the kind that changes posture, changes breath, changes everything without a single instruction being given. One of the guards took a step back, not ordered, not announced, just instinct, as if the space he thought he controlled no longer belonged to him. Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes finally lifting to meet Danielle's fully, not dismissing her now, not overlooking her, but measuring her, trying to understand how far this had already gone. You orchestrated this, he said, and it was not a question. Danielle held his gaze, steady, unflinching. No, she replied, her voice calm but sharper now. I completed it. The distinction landed harder than anything before, because it meant this was not a move in progress, not a strategy unfolding. It was done, already decided, already executed. The board member to Richard's left exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair as if the weight of the realization had finally reached him. Then this meeting, he began, but stopped, because even finishing the sentence required accepting what they had lost. Danielle finished it for him, not louder, not forceful, just precise. This meeting no longer belongs to the people who started it. Her eyes moved across the table again, slower this time, not memorizing, but claiming. Each face, each seat, each position that had once held authority now shifting under the same quiet pressure. The junior associate looked up from her screen, something different in her expression now, not fear, not hesitation, but clarity, as if she had just witnessed the exact moment a system stopped pretending and started revealing itself. Richard straightened in his chair, instinct pulling him back toward control even as it slipped through his hands. "You cannot just walk in and take over a company like this," he said. But even as he spoke, the room did not support him anymore. No nods, no agreement, just silence that leaned away from him instead of toward him. Danielle tilted her head slightly, not in challenge, but in quiet acknowledgement of what had already changed. "I did not just walk in," she said, and for the first time, there was a trace of something deeper in her tone, not anger, not pride, but history. "I have been here longer than you ever noticed." And that was the moment it became clear, not just that the ownership had changed, but that the power in the room had never been what they thought it was. The room did not recover. It adjusted, slowly, uneasily, like a system trying to recalibrate after realizing the rules it relied on were no longer valid. Chairs that once felt anchored now seemed temporary. Voices that once carried weight now hesitated before forming. And at the center of it all, Danielle Brooks remained exactly where she had been, not elevated, not louder, just still, which somehow made everything else feel unstable. Richard Halston inhaled deeply, as if pulling together the last pieces of authority he could find. "Even if what you are saying is accurate," he began, choosing each word carefully now, "governance does not shift in a moment like this. There are procedures, reviews, confirmations." His tone leaned on structure, on process, on the belief that systems could delay what reality had already decided. But across the table, one of the board members shook his head again, slower this time, almost reluctant. "The filings are verified," he said, eyes still on the screen. "Time-stamped, cleared, and executed under federal compliance." Each word landing with quiet finality, stripping away the last argument before it could fully stand. Near the wall, the junior associate straightened slightly, no longer shrinking into the background, her voice gaining clarity as she read further. "There is also an executive directive attached," she added, glancing up briefly before continuing. "It authorizes immediate restructuring of leadership positions at the discretion of the new owner." The phrase settled over the room like a quiet verdict. Restructuring, leadership, discretion, none of them ambiguous, none of them optional. One of the men at the table leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose as if trying to steady himself. "This was planned," he said, not accusing, just stating what had become obvious. Danielle's gaze shifted to him, calm, steady. "Yes," she replied. No hesitation, no need to soften it. Because the truth did not require permission anymore. Richard's hand tightened slightly. Against the edge of the table, the polished wood no longer a symbol of control, but something he was holding onto out of habit. "Then why walk in like this?" he asked, the question quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge. "Why not announce it, schedule it, handle this properly?" Danielle's eyes held his, and for a moment the room felt smaller, more focused, like everything had narrowed to that exchange. "Because," she said, her voice even, but carrying something deeper now, something that reached beyond the transaction itself. "I needed to see how you treat someone you believe has no power." The sentence did not rise, did not accuse directly, but it landed heavier than anything before it, because everyone in the room knew exactly what she meant. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of memory, every glance, every comment, every assumption from minutes earlier replaying without anyone needing to say it out loud. One of the guards stepped back fully now, positioning himself near the door without instruction, his presence no longer part of the equation. The junior associate lowered her eyes briefly, then looked back up at Danielle, something like respect forming where uncertainty had been. And across the table, one by one, shoulders shifted, posture changed, not dramatically, but enough to show the balance had already tipped. Richard finally leaned back in his chair, slower this time. No performance, no control left to project, just acceptance creeping in, whether he wanted it or not. "So what happens now?" he asked, and the question carried something new, not authority, not challenge, but recognition that the answer no longer belonged to him. Danielle did not rush to respond. She let the moment settle, let the room fully arrive at where it stood, and then she spoke. Not louder, not sharper, just clear. Now, she said, we correct what should have never been allowed to. Continue. No one spoke after that. Not immediately, because the weight of her words did not invite interruption. It demanded reflection, and for the first time since the meeting began, the room was no longer trying to control the moment. It was trying to understand it. Danielle shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not claiming space in any obvious way, but somehow the center of the room adjusted around her anyway. Like gravity had quietly changed direction, her eyes moved to the large digital screen, mounted at the front of the room, still displaying projections from a deal that no longer held the same meaning. Turn that off, she said calmly, and for a second no one responded, not because they did not hear her, but because they were not used to taking direction from her. Not yet. Then the junior associate moved first, reaching for the control panel and dimming the screen until it faded to black, and with it, the illusion of the meeting they thought they were running. Danielle nodded once, acknowledging the action without making it a moment. Thank you, she said, and the words landed differently than anything else in the room so far, because they carried respect, something that had been noticeably absent earlier. She turned her attention back to the table, her voice steady, measured. Every decision made in this room today is now subject to review. A slight shift rippled through the board members, not dramatic, but enough to signal discomfort. Effective immediately, she continued. All executive authority previously held by this board is suspended pending reassessment. The phrasing was precise, not emotional, not reactive, just structured, controlled, final. One of the men opened his mouth as if to object, then closed it again, the words finding no ground to stand on. Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back further into his chair, not relaxed, but no longer resisting in the same way. You are dismantling an entire leadership structure in real time, he said, and there was something almost reflective in his tone now, as if he was hearing it himself for the first time. Danielle met his gaze without hesitation. No, she replied. I am correcting a structure that was never designed to be questioned. The distinction settled into the room, quiet but undeniable. Near the wall, one of the assistants lowered their tablet slightly, no longer pretending to be invisible, eyes fixed on Danielle with a mixture of surprise and something closer to admiration. The junior associate straightened again, her earlier hesitation replaced with focus, as if she understood now that she was witnessing something that would be talked about long after this room emptied. Danielle continued, her voice never rising, never needing to. You evaluated presence instead of substance, she said, her eyes moving briefly across the table, not accusing any single person, but holding all of them accountable at once. You made assumptions before asking questions. A pause followed, not for effect, but because the room needed it, needed space to recognize itself in what she was saying. And you tried to remove someone without ever understanding what they carried into this room. Richard's jaw tightened again, but this time there was no immediate response, just a quiet acknowledgement that the pattern she described was not unfamiliar. It was routine. Danielle let the silence sit for a moment longer, then added, softer now, but no less clear, that is not leadership. The sentence did not echo. It settled, deep, and across the table. One of the board members lowered his gaze to the table surface, fingers tracing the edge of a document he no longer seemed to recognize. The guard by the door shifted again, now fully outside the circle of power that had once defined his role, and Danielle, still standing, still composed, looked around the room one more time before speaking again. We are going to rebuild this, she said, and this time, it will not depend on who looks like they belong. The silence did not break. It evolved, shifting from discomfort into something sharper, something more revealing, because now no one in the room could pretend they did not understand what was happening, and that awareness carried its own kind of pressure. Danielle took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to mark the transition, the moment where observation ended and action began. She stepped forward, just one step, but it changed the geometry of the room, placing her not at the edge of the table but aligned with it, as if she had always been meant to stand there. We are going to begin with accountability, she said, her voice calm, controlled, but now carrying direction, not suggestion. Eyes lifted again, not scattered this time, but focused, intentional, landing on Richard first, then moving across each board member in sequence. Every decision made in the last 12 months will be audited, she continued. Every hiring choice, every denied proposal, every closed door that should have been opened. The words were not loud, but they carried structure, like a system being rebuilt in real time. One of the board members shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie as if that small motion could restore some sense of control. "You are assuming misconduct," he said, attempting to anchor the conversation in defensiveness. Danielle shook her head slightly, not dismissive, just precise. "No," she replied. "I am confirming patterns." That landed harder, because patterns did not rely on single moments. They revealed consistency, and consistency was harder to explain away. Near the wall, the junior associate opened a new document on her tablet without being asked, fingers moving with quiet urgency, as if she understood her role had just changed from observer to participant. Danielle noticed, just a glance, just enough to acknowledge it, then returned to the table. "Effective immediately," she said. "All pending promotions are paused." A breath moved through the room, subtle but collective. "Not to punish," she added, her tone steady, "but to ensure they were earned for the right reasons." Richard leaned forward again, slower this time, not confrontational, but searching. "And what qualifies as the right reasons now?" he asked, and the question was no longer a challenge. It was an opening. Danielle met it without hesitation. Results, integrity, and the ability to recognize value before it introduces itself, she said, and the last part lingered, because everyone in the room understood exactly what she meant. One of the assistants near the glass wall lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back up, her posture straighter now, as if the standard Danielle described finally matched something she had been waiting to see. Danielle turned slightly, her attention shifting toward the door where the guards now stood still, no longer active participants, just witnesses. "You can step outside," she said calmly, not dismissing them, but releasing them, and they did not hesitate this time. They nodded once and exited quietly, the door closing with a soft click that felt louder than any command that had been given earlier, because it marked the end of something. The removal of force from a space that no longer required it. Danielle turned back to the table, her presence filling the room without effort. "This company will no longer operate on assumption," she said, "and it will not reward comfort over competence." The words were not dramatic, they were deliberate, and across the table, something shifted again, not resistance, not yet acceptance, but the beginning of alignment, the kind that comes when people realize the rules have changed and they are no longer optional. Danielle paused, just long enough to let the weight of it settle, then added, "And for those who built their position on anything less than that," her gaze steady, unwavering, "this is where your time begins to run out." The air in the room felt different now, not just heavy but precise, like every word carried consequence, and no one was guessing anymore. They were calculating. Danielle remained standing, her posture unchanged, but the room had shifted around her in a way that made sitting feel like a disadvantage, like being lower meant something now. Richard glanced briefly at the others, not for approval, but for alignment, and for the first time, it did not come automatically. One of the board members avoided eye contact entirely. Another stared at the table as if reviewing decisions that could not be undone. Danielle noticed all of it without reacting, because reaction was no longer necessary. She had already taken control of the outcome. "We will start with transparency," she said, her voice cutting clean through the silence. Not performative transparency, not selective reporting, full visibility. The words landed with structure, like policy being written in real time. The junior associate nodded almost instinctively, fingers already moving across her screen as if documenting something that would matter beyond this room. One of the executives finally leaned forward, unable to stay silent any longer. "You are changing everything in less than 30 minutes, he said, not angry, but unsettled. Danielle turned slightly toward him, her expression steady. "No," she replied. "I am revealing everything that was already broken." The distinction settled deeper than any accusation could have, because it removed the idea that this moment was sudden. It framed it as overdue, a quiet truth finally allowed to surface. The executive leaned back again, slower this time, As if realizing the argument he wanted to make no longer applied, Danielle continued. There will be a full internal review of leadership conduct, she said. Every decision that impacted access, advancement, and opportunity will be examined. Her eyes moved again across the table, deliberate, holding each person accountable without raising her voice. And every pattern that favored perception over performance will be corrected. A subtle shift moved through the room, not resistance, but discomfort evolving into awareness. Richard straightened slightly, his tone more controlled now, less defensive. And who determines what qualifies as bias? He asked, and this time the question was not meant to challenge. It was meant to understand the new rules. Danielle met his gaze without hesitation. Data, she said. Consistency, and outcomes that cannot be explained by merit alone. The clarity of it left little room for interpretation. Near the glass wall, one of the assistants exhaled quietly, as if something she had observed for months had just been named without her having to say it. Danielle let the room sit with that for a moment, then added, "This is not about rewriting the past," her tone steady, measured. "It is about refusing to repeat it." The sentence landed with a different kind of weight, not corrective, but forward. One of the board members finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "And if we disagree with your conclusions," he said, and the question hung there carefully, as if he already knew the answer but needed to hear it. Danielle did not hesitate. "Then you will have the opportunity to support your decisions with evidence," she replied. The same standard that should have been applied from the beginning. The room absorbed that slowly, because it did not threaten. It introduced a system that could not be argued with tone or status, only with proof. Danielle shifted her stance slightly, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just settling into the position she had established. "This is where the company changes direction," she said, and her voice, still calm, carried something firmer now, something that did not invite negotiation. "Not because I walked into this room," she continued, "but because this room was never meant to decide who belongs without understanding who earned it." And in that moment, no one interrupted, no one redirected, because the authority in the room had already moved, and everyone could feel exactly where it now stood. The room did not resist anymore. It absorbed, slowly, unevenly, like a system being forced to confront something it had ignored for too long. And in that stillness, something shifted inside Danielle as well. Not outwardly, not in posture or tone, but deeper, quieter, the kind of shift that comes from memory rising to meet the present. Her eyes lowered for just a fraction of a second, not in hesitation, but in recognition, because this room was not new to her. Not really. It was a variation of rooms she had walked into years before, when the table was smaller. The stakes were lower, but the assumptions were exactly the same. She remembered standing outside a conference room at 28, holding a portfolio that represented 3 months of work, waiting to be called in, only to hear laughter through the door, someone inside saying, "She is not ready for this level," without ever opening the file, without ever asking a question. She remembered the way the door finally opened just enough for someone to step out and tell her the meeting had been rescheduled, when it had not. The way her name disappeared from the email thread the next day as if she had never been part of it. The way she went back to her desk, sat down, and kept working anyway, not because she accepted it, but because she understood something then that most people in that room still had not learned now. That access is not always given. Sometimes it is built in silence until it cannot be ignored. Her gaze lifted again, returning to the present, and the boardroom came back into focus, but it did not feel the same anymore, because now she was not outside the door. She was standing at the center of it, and the same kind of voices that once dismissed her were now quiet, waiting, measuring every word she spoke. Danielle took a slow breath, and when she spoke again, her tone carried something new, not sharper, not louder, but grounded in something deeper than authority. "This is not the first room that tried to decide who I was without asking me," she said, and the sentence moved through the space differently than anything before it. Because it was not just about this moment. It was about every moment that led to it. One of the board members shifted in his seat, his expression no longer defensive, but reflective, as if he recognized the pattern she was describing, even if he had never named it before. Danielle continued. "And it is not the first time I was told I did not belong in a place I helped build." Her eyes moved across the table again, slower now, not claiming, not challenging, just revealing. And for the first time, no one looked away, because looking away would have meant denying something they were beginning to understand. Near the wall, the junior associate paused her typing for a moment, her eyes fixed on Danielle with a kind of focus that went beyond observation, as if she was witnessing not just a takeover, but a correction of something larger. Danielle let the silence follow her words, not to create drama, but to give them space to settle, to let the room feel the weight of what had been carried into it long before she walked through the door. And then she added, softer now, but no less certain, the difference is, this time, I do not need permission to stay. And that was where the shift completed, not in the numbers, not in the filings, but in the understanding that the power in the room was not new. It had just finally been recognized, and no one in that room could unsee it anymore. No one spoke after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because every word now carried weight that could not be taken back. And in that silence, Danielle moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with intention. She reached for the chair at the head of the table, the same chair that had anchored authority in this room for years, and without asking, without announcing it, she pulled it back and sat down. The motion simple, controlled, but final, and the sound of the chair, settling into place, echoed louder than any command that had been given earlier, because this time, no one questioned it. No one interrupted it. Richard watched the movement closely, his expression unreadable for a moment, then shifting into something that looked like understanding mixed with something harder to admit, acceptance. Danielle placed her phone gently on the table in front of her, screen facing up, not as a threat, not as a tool, but as proof that everything she needed had already been done. We are going to formalize this transition, she said, her voice steady, aligned with the position she now occupied. Not because it requires validation, she added, her eyes lifting briefly, but because clarity matters. The distinction settled into the room, reinforcing that this was not about permission, it was about structure. One of the board members nodded slowly, almost involuntarily, as if the logic of it could not be denied, even if the shift still felt unfamiliar. The junior associate straightened further, opening a new document labeled Transition Protocol without being asked, her movements precise now, confident, as if she understood her role had expanded in real time. Danielle continued, all current contracts under negotiation are paused effective immediately, she said, glancing briefly toward the now dark screen at the front of the room. Every agreement will be reevaluated under revised leadership standards. One of the executives inhaled as if preparing to object, then paused, reconsidered, and remained silent, because the structure Danielle was outlining did not leave space for reaction, only compliance or evidence. Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now, stripped of earlier resistance. And the board? He asked, not challenging, but seeking definition. Danielle met his gaze directly. The board will remain in place temporarily, she said. Under review, she added, precise, measured, leaving no ambiguity about the shift in their role. The word temporarily carried its own kind of gravity, not immediate removal, but no guarantee of continuation, and everyone at the table understood exactly what that meant. One of the members lowered his eyes briefly, processing the reality that his position was no longer secured by tenure or familiarity. Danielle let the room absorb that, then continued. Each of you will submit a full report of your decision-making over the past fiscal year, she said. Not summaries, not highlights, full accountability. The phrasing was deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation. Near the wall, one of the assistants exchanged a quick glance with another, both of them aware that what was being asked now was something they had never seen required before. Danielle's gaze moved once more across the table, slower this time, not asserting, but confirming. This is not about removing people, she said. It is about identifying who should have been here all along. The words settled deeper than anything procedural, because they redefined the purpose of the room itself, not as a fixed structure, but as something that could be corrected, refined, rebuilt. Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back again, not in resistance, but in recalibration, as if he was adjusting to a reality that no longer revolved around him. Danielle rested her hands lightly on the table, composed, steady, fully present in the role she had claimed without asking. And then she said, with quiet finality, "Now we begin again, but this time, we do it right." The room did not move forward immediately. It settled into the new order, like a machine recalibrating after realizing its original settings were flawed. And for the first time, no one rushed to fill the silence, because silence now carried meaning. Danielle remained seated at the head of the table, her presence no longer questioned, no longer evaluated, just acknowledged. And that shift alone changed the rhythm of everything. Richard folded his hands slowly in front of him, not as a display of authority, but as someone preparing to listen rather than lead. "If this is a reset," he said carefully, choosing his words with more awareness than before, "then what defines the standard moving forward?" The question did not challenge her, it positioned her, and everyone in the room felt that distinction. Danielle leaned back slightly in the chair, composed, measured, her voice steady as she answered. "Consistency," she said. "Measured outcomes, transparent processes, and leadership that does not depend on perception." The words were not new, but in this room, at this moment, they carried weight that could not be ignored. One of the board members nodded slowly, not out of agreement alone, but out of recognition, as if something that had always been obvious was finally being enforced. Danielle continued. "No more informal gatekeeping," she said, her eyes moving briefly across the table. "No more decisions made behind closed conversations that never get documented." A subtle tension moved through the room, not resistance, but exposure, because those practices were not unfamiliar, they were standard, and now they were being named. The junior associate paused her typing for a moment, glancing up, absorbing each word like it was rewriting the rules she had been expected to follow. Danielle let the moment settle, then added, "Every opportunity, every advancement, every denial will be traceable to data." Her tone remained calm, but the structure behind it was undeniable, one of. The executives exhaled quietly, leaning back in his chair as if adjusting to a weight he had not anticipated carrying. "That will slow everything down," he said, not in opposition, but in concern. Danielle met his gaze without hesitation. "Then we have been moving too fast in the wrong direction," she replied, and the answer did not argue. It reframed, leaving no room to defend the pace without questioning the outcomes it had produced. Richard glanced briefly at the others, then back at Danielle. "And leadership?" he asked. "What qualifies someone now?" Danielle's expression remained steady, but her answer carried something sharper, something more defined. "The ability to recognize value before it proves itself to you," she said. "The discipline to question your own assumptions, and the integrity to correct them when you are wrong." The words landed with precision, not as criticism, but as a standard that could not be avoided. Near the wall, one of the assistants straightened, her posture reflecting something new, not fear, not uncertainty, but possibility, as if the system being described finally aligned with something she had been waiting to see. Danielle allowed a brief pause, not to emphasize, but to give space for the room to absorb what had just been established. Then she leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly on the table, grounding the moment. "This company does not need louder voices," she said. "It needs clearer ones." The sentence settled deeper than anything procedural, because it redefined influence itself, not as volume, but as clarity. And across the table, something shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to signal that the room was no longer resisting the change. It was beginning to align with it. Danielle's gaze moved once more across every face, steady, composed, and then she said, with quiet finality, "If you can lead under that standard, you stay. If you cannot, this is where your role ends. Not later, not eventually here." No one answered immediately, not because they did not understand what Danielle had said, but because responding now meant choosing a position, and positions in this room no longer came without consequence. The silence stretched just long enough to feel deliberate. Then one of the board members shifted forward, hands clasped together as if grounding himself before speaking. "If the standard is evidence," he said carefully, "then we should begin with the current leadership, starting here." The statement did not challenge Danielle. It aligned with her, and that alignment carried more weight than any agreement spoken earlier. Danielle gave a small nod, not approving, but acknowledging, "We already have." she replied, her tone even, controlled, and with that, she reached for her phone, tapping the screen once, not hurried, not dramatic, just precise, and almost immediately, a notification sound echoed softly from multiple devices around the table, emails arriving in real time, one by one, each marked executive review file. The room shifted again, this time not from uncertainty, but from confrontation, because now the system she described was no longer theoretical. It was active. One of the executives opened the file first, his eyes scanning quickly, then slowing, then stopping entirely, his posture tightening as if the words in front of him had weight. Another followed, then another, the quiet of the room filling with the soft movement of screens and controlled breathing. Danielle remained still, watching, allowing the process to speak for itself. Because the truth did not need to be delivered twice, Richard hesitated for a moment before opening his own file, his expression composed, but his movements more deliberate than before, as if he understood that whatever was inside would not be easy to dismiss. The junior associate glanced up briefly, observing the shift with a clarity that had replaced her earlier hesitation. She was no longer watching a meeting, she was watching accountability unfold in real time. One of the board members finally spoke, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. These are flagged decisions, he said, eyes still on the screen. Patterns of exclusion, repeated over multiple quarters. The words did not accuse, they documented, and that made them harder to argue against. Danielle nodded once, her gaze steady. Each file is supported by data, she said. Not assumptions, not interpretations, outcomes. The distinction settled into the room again, reinforcing the standard she had already established. Another executive leaned back slowly, his hand moving to his forehead as if processing more than just numbers. This is comprehensive, he admitted, and there was no resistance in his tone now. Only recognition. Richard closed his file halfway, not dismissing it, but pausing, his eyes lifting to Danielle. You prepared all of this before walking into this room, he said. And again, it was not a question. Danielle met his gaze without hesitation. No, she replied calmly. I have been preparing this for years. And that was where the room shifted one more time, not in power, not in structure, but in understanding, because what they were facing was not a sudden decision, not a reaction. It was the result of patience, observation, and precision built over time. One of the assistants near the wall straightened fully now, no longer trying to remain invisible, her attention fixed on Danielle with something that looked like respect earned in real time. Danielle allowed the room to sit with the files, to read, to recognize, to confront what could no longer be ignored. Then she spoke again, her voice steady, but carrying finality. This is where the system proves itself, she said, not in how it protects power, but in how it responds to truth. And as the words settled, no one in the room reached for authority, no one redirected the conversation, because for the first time, authority had been replaced by something stronger, something quieter, something undeniable. Accountability. The room did not need more explanation. The files had already done what words could not. They had drawn lines where none had been acknowledged before, and now those lines were visible to everyone. Danielle sat still at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly against the surface, her presence steady, not pressing, not forcing, just allowing the truth to settle into every corner of the room. One of the board members closed his tablet slowly, exhaling through his nose as if something inside him had finally shifted from defense to acceptance. These decisions were signed, he said quietly, not to challenge, but to recognize, approved at the highest level. His eyes lifted briefly, not accusing anyone directly, but acknowledging the structure that had enabled it. Danielle nodded once, not surprised, not reactive. And now they are being reviewed at the highest level, she replied, her tone even, balanced, but final, the symmetry of the statement leaving no space to question the authority behind it. Richard remained still for a moment longer, then reached forward and closed his file completely, the action deliberate, not dismissive, but conclusive. His eyes met Danielle's, and this time there was no resistance left in them, only recognition of what had already changed. Then we proceed, he said, and the words carried something new, not control, but alignment. Danielle inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the shift without emphasizing it. We proceed, she confirmed, her voice calm, measured, but now carrying execution, not just direction. She reached for her phone again, tapping once, and almost immediately another series of notifications moved through the room, not chaotic, not overwhelming, just precise, structured, each one marked leadership status update. The room responded differently this time. No hesitation, no confusion, just attention, because now they understood that every update mattered. One of the executives opened the notification, his eyes scanning quickly before he leaned back, the realization settling in. Access revoked. He said under his breath, not in shock, but in confirmation. Another followed, then another, each update reshaping the structure in real time. Danielle remained composed, watching, not intervening, because the system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Richard glanced down at his own device, then back up, his expression steady, but quieter than before. You are restructuring the entire leadership framework in one session, he said, and there was no accusation in it now, only acknowledgement. Danielle met his gaze. No, she replied, her voice soft but precise. I am removing what should not have been holding it together. The distinction landed clearly, because it reframed everything not as destruction, but as correction. Near the wall, the junior associate paused again, looking up from her screen, her expression no longer uncertain, no longer cautious, but clear, as if she was witnessing the exact moment where a system chose integrity over comfort. Danielle let the room absorb the updates, the changes, the quiet shifts that no longer needed to be explained. Then she spoke again, her tone unchanged, but her words carrying finality. This is not punishment, she said. This is alignment. A pause followed, not for emphasis, but because the room needed it, needed to feel the difference between reaction and intention. Every role that remains, she continued, will be held by someone who can defend it with evidence, not assumption. The clarity of it settled deeper than any directive, because it defined the future without needing to reference the past. One of the board members straightened slightly, his posture adjusting as if preparing for something new rather than clinging to something old. Danielle's gaze moved across the table one last time, steady, composed, and then she said, with quiet certainty, and from this point forward, no one in this room will ever have to prove they belong by surviving it. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted beyond repair, not broken, but corrected, and correction does not reverse, it replaces. Danielle remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the final words to settle into something more permanent than sound, something closer to understanding. Then she stood, not abruptly, not to signal departure, but to close the moment with the same control she had carried from the beginning. The chair moved back quietly, no echo this time, because the room no longer resisted her movement. It followed it. Richard watched her rise, his posture adjusting without thought, not in submission, but in recognition of where authority now stood. Around the table, others followed subtly, shoulders straightening, eyes lifting, not because they were instructed to, but because something in the structure had realigned. Danielle placed one hand lightly on the table, grounding herself in the space she had reclaimed, and her gaze moved across the room one final time, not measuring, not claiming, just acknowledging. This company will not remember this as a disruption, she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying through the room without effort. It will remember this as the moment it finally became what it was supposed to be. No one interrupted, because there was nothing left to challenge, only something left to carry forward. The junior associate lowered her tablet slowly, her expression clear, focused, as if she had just witnessed the standard she would hold for the rest of her career. One of the executives nodded once, almost instinctively, not agreeing out of obligation, but aligning with something that now made sense in a way it had not before. Danielle continued, her tone softer now, but no less precise. You do not lose your position because I walked into this room, she said. You lose it if you cannot stand in it under the truth. The sentence landed with finality, not as a threat, but as a definition, and definitions do not argue. They remain. Richard exhaled slowly, his eyes steady on Danielle, and for the first time, there was no attempt to reclaim the moment, No effort to reshape it. Only acceptance that the moment had already chosen its direction. Danielle stepped back from the table. Just one step. Enough to signal that the transition was no longer in motion. It was complete. Everything moving forward will reflect this standard, she said. Not selectively, not temporarily, consistently. The words settled deeper than the rest, because consistency is what turns change into reality. Near the door, the assistants remained still, not dismissed, not overlooked, but present, part of a system that now acknowledged them in a way it had not before. Danielle turned slightly toward the exit, then paused, just for a moment, and without looking back, she added, I did not need to raise my voice to be heard. Her tone steady, grounded in something beyond the room itself. I became the standard you could no longer ignore. And with that, she walked forward, not rushed, not dramatic, just certain. And behind her, the room did not collapse. It recalibrated, quietly, permanently, into something stronger than it had ever been before.